In a war where drones have turned tanks into some of the easiest targets on the battlefield, something strange is now happening in Ukraine. Instead of disappearing, tanks may be coming back in a form Russia did not expect. Not as symbols of old armored power, and not in the way military planners once imagined, but as something harder to read, harder to stop, and far more dangerous once the battlefield begins to shift. That is what makes this story so serious, because the issue here is no longer just whether a tank can survive under modern fire. The bigger issue is whether Ukraine has started to find a new way to keep armor useful in a war that was supposed to make it obsolete. If that is true, then this is not only a story about one vehicle, one tactic, or one moment at the front. It may be a sign that the rules of armored warfare are changing again, right in the middle of the Ukraine war. Stay with military force because the real question is not only what Ukraine is doing with its tanks, but why that shift could create a much bigger problem for Russia than it first appears. What makes this reported Leopard 2A6 shot so important is not only the distance, but the fact that it challenges the normal picture of tank combat in Ukraine. Several battlefield-focused outlets said a Ukrainian Leopard 2A6 may have hit a Russian T-72B3 at about 5.5 kilometers in early April 2026. If that claim is true, it would sit far outside the range most people connect with modern tank-against-tank fighting, especially in a war where drones, mines, broken terrain, and fast detection usually push armored clashes into shorter and far more dangerous spaces. That is why this report spread so quickly through military circles. It was not presented as just another destroyed Russian vehicle. It was presented as a shot that could force analysts to look again at how Western armor is being used on this battlefield. A tank was suddenly back in the spotlight, not because it charged through a line, but because it may have reached out from a distance that feels closer to artillery logic than classic armored maneuver. And once that idea enters the discussion, the real question stops being whether the hit sounds dramatic and becomes whether something bigger is changing behind it. The reason this case stands out even more is that tank warfare in Ukraine has rarely rewarded long, clean, textbook engagements. Visibility is often poor, movement is risky, and armor that stays exposed for too long can be found by drones and hit by artillery, anti-tank teams, or loitering munitions. That reality has trained both sides to think in terms of survival first and decisive armor duels second. So when a reported hit appears at 5.5 kilometers, it grabs attention because it seems to come from a different logic. It suggests patience, preparation, and controlled fire instead of a chaotic close encounter. It also suggests that Ukraine may be trying to use the Leopard 2A6 as more than a direct assault tool. If the platform can threaten Russian armor from much farther back than expected, then its value changes. It becomes not just a vehicle that survives under pressure, but one that may shape the fight before the enemy even understands where the threat is coming from. That is the point where one reported kill starts to look less like an isolated event and more like a sign worth following. Still, this is exactly where caution matters. The claim has been reported, but there is no widely published sensor package, combat footage, or full public evidence that closes every question around the strike. That does not prove the story is false, but it does mean the event should be treated as a serious battlefield report rather than a fully settled fact. That distinction is important because wars produce both real breakthroughs and fast-moving narratives. A strong analysis has to separate the two. The smart way to read this episode is to hold both ideas at once. First, the report is credible enough to deserve attention because it was repeated in defense reporting and framed as an unusual achievement. Second, the absence of complete open proof means the larger conclusion must stay measured. What matters here is not blind belief, but the possibility that this shot points to a real shift in how Ukraine is using a high-end Western tank under modern combat pressure. That is where the story becomes more interesting than the headline itself. The deeper meaning of this episode is the contradiction it exposes at the center of the war. Drones were supposed to push tanks further into the background, yet a Western tank is now drawing attention because of a possible long-range kill that only makes sense in a battlefield shaped by new methods. That is why this moment matters even before full confirmation arrives. It opens a larger question about adaptation. Ukraine does not need every tank action to become legendary. It needs enough of them to show that armor can still matter when used in ways the older playbook did not expect. If that is what this shot represents, then Russia is not only facing another weapon on the field. It is facing a different idea of how old heavy platforms can survive and strike in a war transformed by sensors, data, and constant aerial threat. And once that possibility is on the table, the next step is to ask what made such a shot technically possible in the first place. What may have made this shot possible was not one miracle feature, but a strong technical base working under the right conditions. The Leopard 2A6 already carries a serious combat package, and that starts with its Rheinmetall 120mm L55 smoothbore gun. That longer barrel helps give armor-piercing rounds higher velocity, which matters when the target is far away and every small loss of energy can change the result. The tank also has a stabilized sight, thermal imaging, and a laser rangefinder, so the crew is not firing with guesswork. Its fire control system can process distance, ammunition type, wind, altitude, and barrel wear, which gives the gunner a much better chance of placing the first round where it needs to go. That does not mean a 5.5-kilometer hit becomes easy. It means the platform at least has the tools to try something unusual if the battlefield conditions are favorable enough. And that is where the story starts to move away from raw hardware and toward coordination. The most important part of a shot like this may have happened before the crew even touched the trigger. At that range, the real challenge is not only firing far. The harder task is finding the target, tracking it, and building a firing solution before the window closes. That is why reconnaissance drones likely played a major role. A drone above the area could spot the T-72B3, watch whether it was moving or stopping, and report the exact position back to the Leopard crew. It could also help confirm terrain, spacing, and line of sight in ways that a tank crew alone might struggle to do from the ground. In a war shaped by constant aerial observation, the tank no longer has to work as a lone hunter. It can act as the shooter at the end of a larger combat network. Once that idea is understood, the shot begins to look less like an isolated act of skill and more like the product of a connected battlefield system. That system matters even more when the target itself offers only a small moment of vulnerability. For a kill at that distance to succeed, the Russian tank likely had to be standing still, moving slowly, or exposing a weak area at exactly the wrong time. A fast-moving target is much harder to hit, even with a powerful gun and modern optics. But a vehicle that pauses, turns awkwardly, or presents the turret ring, mantlet, or lower glacis becomes a more realistic target. That means timing may have been just as important as technology. The round still had to arrive with enough force, but the target also had to be in the right place and in the wrong posture. This is why surveillance is so important in modern armored warfare. It is not only about seeing the enemy. It is about waiting until the enemy reveals the exact angle that turns a hard shot into a possible one. And once that timing is fed into the gun line, a tank starts to behave very differently from the old battlefield model. What this suggests is that the Leopard 2A6 did not become more dangerous only because of its gun. It became more dangerous because it may have been linked to drones, sensors, and real-time target updates in one chain. That is the real tactical lesson here. If the reported 5.5-kilometer strike is true, then the most important fact is not simply that a shell traveled an extreme distance. The deeper point is that Ukraine may now be connecting aerial reconnaissance and armored fire with enough speed and precision to create a unified kill chain. In that kind of system, the tank is no longer just a vehicle that sees and shoots on its own. It becomes the final striking arm of a wider network that finds, studies, and prepares the target before the shot is taken. And if that network keeps improving, then the pressure on Russian armor will not come from one weapon alone, but from the way several systems are beginning to work as one. What matters here is that Ukraine appears to be pushing the Leopard 1A5 into a role it was never meant to fill. Ukrainian forces were using Leopard 1A5 tanks for indirect fire from covered positions, with a range of about 12 kilometers, and that figure could rise to roughly 18 kilometers with a different turret setup. That is a serious shift in battlefield logic, because the Leopard 1A5 was built as an older main battle tank, not as a purpose-built self-propelled howitzer. In simple terms, Ukraine is trying to turn a direct fire platform into a longer-range support asset, and that says a great deal about how the war is forcing armies to improvise under pressure. The reason this matters is easy to understand. A tank that fires in the open can be found by drones, tracked by artillery, and hit by anti-tank teams very quickly. A tank that fires from a screened or covered position has a better chance to survive, especially in a war where the sky is crowded with sensors, and even a short mistake can be fatal. That does not turn the Leopard 1A5 into perfect artillery, but it can give Ukraine another source of controlled fire without exposing the vehicle in the old-style frontal role. This is less about romance around tanks and more about cold battlefield math, which is why the role change deserves attention. There is also a technical reason why this idea has not appeared out of nowhere. Reporting around Belgium's Leopard 1 modernization effort said the Cockerel 3105 turret and its 105mm gun were being promoted with indirect fire capability from covered positions, a feature described as uncommon for Western tanks. That matters because it gives at least one path for how an older Leopard hull could become more useful in a support role than many people expected. The point is not that every Ukrainian Leopard 1A5 suddenly has this exact setup. The point is that the battlefield and the upgrade market are moving in the same direction, and both are rewarding platforms that can shoot, stay hidden, and relocate before return fire arrives. That is where an aging tank starts to look less like a leftover machine and more like an adaptable fire base. The larger meaning goes beyond one vehicle model. Ukraine is not only trying to keep tanks alive, it is trying to redistribute their role across the battlefield. If a Leopard 1A5 can support troops from the rear, then it helps reduce pressure on other scarce systems and gives commanders another option when artillery tubes, ammunition, and protected fire platforms are all under strain. That matters in a long war of attrition, because survival and output often matter more than elegance. An old tank that can still deliver useful fire from safety may offer more practical value than a more modern vehicle forced into the wrong mission. That is why this change should be read as a sign of adaptation, not a side note. What emerges from all this is a different picture of armored warfare. The Leopard 1. A5 is no longer tied only to the idea of breakthrough, speed, and close contact combat. In Ukrainian service, it appears to be moving toward a role built around protected firing positions, controlled support, and quick repositioning after the job is done. That pattern fits the broader direction of the war, where firepower must be preserved, not wasted, and where every platform has to justify its place under drone-saturated skies. So the real story is not that Ukraine found a strange use for an old tank. The real story is that armor is being reorganized around endurance, distance, and flexibility. And that shift leads directly into the question of how Ukraine is also trying to keep these vehicles alive under repeated drone attack. What makes this Leopard 1A5 case so important is not only the number 52, but what that number says about survival in a drone war. According to Ukrainian reporting, one Leopard 1A5 endured 52 drone attacks in a single day and still kept supporting troops instead of turning into another burned-out vehicle. In this war, that kind of result immediately gets attention because FPV drones have become one of the most common and feared threats to any armored platform. A tank can be heavy, expensive, and powerful, but none of that guarantees safety when cheap drones can strike from above, from the side, or at the moment a crew makes one mistake. So when a Leopard stays alive under that level of pressure, the real issue is no longer just armor thickness. The real issue is whether Ukraine has found a more practical way to keep tanks useful under constant aerial attack. And that takes the story into a much bigger argument. The protection on that Leopard should not be dismissed as crude improvisation, because it looks more like a battlefield survival package built for a new kind of threat. Reports described layers such as steel cages, netting, extra armor patches, and metal cable defenses often compared to a hedgehog shape. The logic is simple but effective. Some of these additions can break a drone's propellers, trigger an early blast, or reduce the chance that the explosive charge hits the most vulnerable point on the tank. That does not make the vehicle invincible, and it does not mean every attack will fail. What it does mean is that Ukraine is trying to force Russian drone teams to spend more time, more drones, and more effort for a kill that used to come much easier. Once a tank can absorb that kind of pressure and stay in the fight, its battlefield value starts to change. That change becomes even clearer when the role of the tank is viewed through a wider lens. Ukraine is not trying to bring tanks back in the old classic form, where armor simply rushes forward and breaks the line by weight and speed alone. Instead, it is reshaping them into flexible combat platforms that can do different jobs depending on the sector, the threat level, and the mission. A tank can become a long-range shooter in one situation, a protected fire support asset in another, or a defensive strongpoint when drone danger is too high for open movement. That is a major doctrinal shift, because it treats the tank less like a symbol of offensive power and more like a controlled tool inside a wider combat system. And once that shift is understood, the vehicle starts to look less like a relic and more like a platform being adapted to modern war. That is why this part of the story sits at the center of the whole article. Ukraine is not proving that tanks are young again. It is proving that tanks can still matter if they live longer, fire smarter, and work inside a network shaped by drones, sensors, and field modification. In other words, the value of armor now depends less on old doctrine and more on how quickly it can adapt under pressure. And when that adaptation begins to include not only battlefield changes, but also new ways of preparing crews before combat, the picture becomes even more serious. What gives Ukraine an edge here is not only what its tanks can do in battle, but how its crews are being prepared before battle even begins. Ukraine is now training Leopard 2A4 crews with mixed reality systems instead of relying only on live vehicles, live rounds, and full field exercises. Business Insider reported on April 2nd that this effort uses advanced headsets supplied through Find Reality and Varjo, with 39 systems in the first rollout and a program value of about $8.45 million. The point is simple but important. A crew can practice procedures, coordination, and target work again and again without burning fuel, wearing out engines, or consuming ammunition that is badly needed at the front. In a long war, that matters because readiness is no longer just about courage or hardware. It is also about how cheaply and how quickly a force can turn training time into combat ability. And that is where the story starts to widen. This training model matters even more because it protects scarce equipment while building skill at the same time. If tanks are needed near the front, then every hour spent on traditional training carries a cost. Real vehicles need maintenance. Real firing drills consume stock. Real movement creates wear that can shorten the life of a platform before it reaches the fight that actually matters. Mixed reality cuts part of that burden. It also reduces the need to expose valuable tanks during instruction, which helps preserve them for combat missions instead of routine preparation. In other words, Ukraine is not only teaching crews to operate armor, it is trying to protect the limited fleet it already has, and that logic becomes sharper when placed beside the scale of Russian armored losses. That comparison is where the strategic pressure becomes easier to see. According to the Ukrainian Defense Ministry's April 14th update, Russia's estimated tank losses had reached 11,863. Even allowing for the normal caution around wartime claims, the broader point remains serious. Russia has taken very heavy armored losses over a long period, while Ukraine is trying to squeeze more life, more value, and more battlefield effect out of each tank it still fields. That means the contest is no longer only about who has more steel. It is also about who uses steel more intelligently. If one side is forced to replace vehicles under constant strain, while the other side extends combat life through better training, field modification, and smarter employment, then numbers alone stop telling the full story, and the war begins to reward efficiency as much as mass. That is why the bigger lesson here goes beyond one Leopard model or one training program. Ukraine appears to be combining older platforms, Western systems, real-time data, and flexible doctrine into a method built for a drone-dominated battlefield. This does not mean the entire balance of the war changes overnight. It does mean that adaptation is becoming one of the most valuable weapons on the field. A force that links technology, crew preparation, battlefield sensing, and creative use of existing armor can hold its advantage longer in a grinding war of attrition. And when that happens, the real contest is no longer about whether tanks still matter. It is about which side is learning faster how to make them matter under entirely new rules. What stands out most in this story is not only one reported long-range Leopard 2A6 shot, and not only one Leopard 1A5 surviving a wave of drone attacks, but the larger shift behind both events. Ukraine appears to be testing a new way to use tanks in modern war. Instead of treating armor as a tool for one old mission, it is spreading that armor across several jobs, including long-range direct fire, indirect support from covered ground, and defensive fire positions that can stay alive longer under drone pressure. Behind that change is a wider combat system built on reconnaissance drones, real-time data, field modification, mixed reality training, and careful use of every vehicle that is still battle-ready. That is the deeper message here. Drone warfare did not simply erase the value of tanks. It forced armies to rethink how tanks survive, where they fire from, and how they fit into a battlefield filled with sensors and constant threat. And if Ukraine keeps improving that model, Russia may face not only fewer targets to destroy, but smarter armor to fight. Subscribe to Military Force for more deep coverage of modern warfare, battlefield adaptation, and the real shifts shaping this war.